And I'm Nancy Steck, and I'm with the New Jersey Lawyers Assistance Program, and this is our monthly Networkers Without Borders meeting. And we're doing it today in conjunction with the Bar Association's Special Committee on Lawyer Transition. So welcome for the folks who are here with that group. And I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Rosemary Manfredi, who is going to be leading us through this, I think, really interesting program today. We've often talked about making a transition from one career to another, one practice of law to another. And, you know, we've talked about the hows and the questions about how to do that. But I think we finally have somebody who can give us some guidance as to what those hows look like. Having a holistic understanding is critical to finding a career that suits us, our natural abilities, skills, values, interests, and working style. And Dr. Manfredi will review these factors and traits using the Highlands Whole Person Model for making career decisions. And she'll also be going into some career battery tests, some that maybe you know and some that you probably don't know. Rosemary is a neuropsychologist in private practice in Bensalem, Pennsylvania. And I'm really pleased that she's with us today, and I'm looking forward to learning a whole lot. Rosemary.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for having me today. I want to talk today about, as Nancy was saying, career assessment and how that can really help in making career decisions, whether your career decision is changing a career, whether your career decision is staying in the same field but maybe going into a different area of that field, or whether your decision is staying in your job but maybe making your role suit you a little bit better. So all of that requires a deep understanding of yourself and a systematic way of doing that. I think that's where career assessment really comes into play. Most of what we talk about today, as you think about these areas, you may know some of these things about yourself already. You probably have insight into what some of your values are, what some of your interests are, but you may not have really explored that in a in-depth or really systematic way. So what I'm going to present today is an overview of a way of doing that using the Highlands Whole Person Model as a framework to really talk about how we can think about those kinds of decisions and the different factors that go into that, so that your career decisions are more intentional and purposeful, that you have more clarity in that decision making. Due to sort of time constraints, this isn't going to be a comprehensive review of all career assessments that are out there or all the different career theories. That's why I'm kind of chosen to focus on the Highlands. But I will certainly integrate some others as they are relevant. Let's see if I can, there we go. So I know I'm presenting to the Lawyers Assistance Program, so I just have a disclaimer that I am a neuropsychologist, but this webinar is not intended as specific medical advice. So this doesn't imply any kind of doctor-patient relationship. And also for confidentiality reasons, I would ask that if you have specific questions that are unique to you, that we can set up a consultation or discuss them privately, or you can contact someone in your area. That the questions I'm going to address in the webinar format are things that are more general or that would be applicable to several people. So I will just ask for that. So just a little bit of background about me. I am a neuropsychologist, as Nancy mentioned. I am in private practice. My private practice specializes in neurodevelopmental disorders, which include autism, ADHD, learning differences as the primary areas. So some of you may have read my background that we sent out and may be wondering, well, why are you here talking about career assessment? Or you may be wondering, I don't have one of those conditions, so how is this relevant to me? And so I'm going to just talk a little bit before we start about how I got to the Highlands and how I conceptualize that and how that interacts with different kinds of conditions. So I see people throughout the lifespan with different neurological conditions. And what I was finding in my practice was that as I may start seeing someone as a child and see them every 2 or 3 years, and as they got closer to being an adult, the questions were no longer about what do they have a diagnosis or how can we support them in education, but it was really about what are they going to do with the rest of their life. We pay a lot of attention to development in children because that's a period of rapid development. But then we just assume when you turn 18 or 21, and then you have the rest of your life that, you know, everything is the same or that all adults are the same. And we know that that's not true, but we don't really pay as much attention in psychology as a field to adult development. And so there was really just a lack of information. I do really comprehensive evaluations for a lot of people, but it wasn't really relating to what kind of careers would be useful. So I started looking into, I do assessment, I specialize in doing evaluations. I know how much an evaluation can be helpful because it really is as we talked about earlier, a systematic way of distilling a lot of information into an actionable plan. And so I really value that process. I think it's very time efficient and a good way to do that as opposed to trial and error. So I started looking and seeing, you know, what career assessments are out there. And for the most part, what I was finding was there were interest inventories, which we'll talk about later, but it was really about assessing whether you're interested in different kinds of jobs. So I'll give you some examples of the tools, but it might ask you questions like, do you like to work outside? Do you like to work with people? Do you like to work with animals? And you rate that usually on some kind of dimension of, you know, I would hate that, all the way up to I would love that, and everything in between. And then based on those interests, it gives you some career ideas that would fit with things that you're interested in. And that's a good start. That gives you some information. It may give you some ideas of careers that you hadn't thought of. You know, if you're really interested in working in the medical field, you know, it may give you a couple different options of what specific areas of medicine to work in. But it doesn't relate that to your abilities and your skills in some other areas. So while you may be interested in having a certain type of career, there may be other factors that impact whether that career is realistic for you, and whether it's something that you want to put the effort in. If you want to be a surgeon, but you don't want to go to medical school and residency and do all of that training, then that might not be the career for you. So we have to think beyond just what we're interested in, and to see whether that's a good match. So I saw a bunch of interest inventories and I thought about that. And then I saw that there's some other ones. Some of you may have even taken some of these in different environments that you've worked in. One that comes to mind is like the Myers-Briggs type indicator. So this is where it's more looking at your personality style. And you'll hear people say, you know, I'm an INTJ, or give you like this 4-letter code that describes how they interact in the workplace. And it looks at things like whether you're introverted or extroverted, or whether you are somebody who does things based on intuition, or you are someone who's more logical in your thinking. And by understanding that, you can understand how you make decisions, and it also helps you understand other people, because you can recognize that while you may think of things in a systematic or logical way, other people may not. So that's another area that was really out there in career assessment. And there's some other specific career assessments, like if you were looking for like specific jobs, typing speed, or, you know, looking at specific skills. But I was really looking for something that was more holistic and that really encompassed more than just what you were interested in, or more than just personality style. And there's a few reasons for that. And one is that we're learning more about how the brain works. So we used to think that and I'm a neuropsychologist, so I'm very interested in this. We used to think that, everybody has a brain in their head, and we can just kind of look in, and everybody's brain looks the same, and it functions the same way. And that was the predominant idea in neuropsychology for a long time, which was that, this part of the brain does this function, this part of the brain does this function, and everyone's brains work the same. But what we're learning now is that brains work in lots of different ways, and you have probably experienced this in your life. If you know that there are certain ways of learning that work better for you than other ways of learning. Some people are really good with words, and reading is a really strong way for them to learn. Other people do better with numbers. Other people do better with hands-on types of activities. And it's not that one of these learning modalities is better than the other. It's just different. And we all have those strengths and weaknesses. We all have the things that come naturally to us, that really are easy for us, that energize us, that excite us. And we have the things that we just are difficult for us, or that we just don't like. And that, so for some of us, there's certain things that no matter how much you practice it, you're not really going to get good at it. Just to give you an example, so I was just recently having a conversation with my mom about when I started kindergarten, and how I couldn't cut. And using scissors was not something that I was very good at. I had to do cutting practice. My mom had meetings with the teacher about, everybody else can cut and use scissors, and Rosemary is really struggling with that. And to this day, as an adult, I'm still not very good at scissors. And you think that I have, so many hours of practice, and I've worked on this, and still it's not a strength of mine. In fact, my one of my lowest grades in college was on a project where I had to make a poster. So this is the early 2000s, when computers were just starting to be used a lot more, and people were starting to have laptops. But we had to make a poster for a science class on actual cardboard and cut things out. And I lost credit not for the content, but for the presentation, because I can't cut straight, and things were not lined up, and I did the best that I could, but I'm just not good at that. And so that for me is one of those things that no matter how much I practice, no matter how much I work on it, I've sort of hit the limit. And that probably there's ways of improving that if I were to work with an occupational therapist maybe, but it's not really relevant to my career. And I've been able to work in a field where I don't need to use scissors. Or I can get things like a Cricut, which is a crafting device, which cuts all sorts of fancy cuts that I don't have to use the scissors. So I found ways to accommodate that. But this is all called neurodiversity, right? This is the way that people's brains process information, the skills that they have are different. And neuropsychology, we're really learning more and more about neurodiversity and how that impacts how people perform. And it's not just people who have disorders. It's not just people who have ADHD and autism and learning differences. While they certainly fall under that diverse groups, even people who don't have those disorders have varying strengths and weaknesses. And it's part of the reason why having a diverse team in an organization and having a diversity of opinions is really good, because people have different strengths and people bring different experiences to that environment. So that's kind of how I got to finding the Highlands, because I was really interested in this neurodiversity piece and how to relate that to careers. The other thing we know is that the same idea can be implemented in multiple different ways. So just because I think that this is the best way to do something doesn't necessarily mean that it is. And there may be other perspectives. So having that diverse perspective in the workplace is really good for innovation and thinking, and helps to prevent sort of groupthink, which is where everybody thinks the same and you just sort of reinforce each other, and there's lack of innovation. So that brought me to the Highlands, and that's where I discovered the Highlands. And I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to the Highlands Whole Person Model, which forms the background for the assessment. Then I'll talk a little bit more specifically about what the assessment looks like for those of you who are interested, just so you kind of know what a career assessment entails. But these are some of the underlying principles or the ideas behind the Highlands. And the Highlands Company was kind enough to let me use these slides. But the idea is that there is no specific answer. So when you go for a career assessment, that counselor or evaluator can't tell you you should do this exact job, because there's lots of factors that go into that. But the more you know about yourself and what you would like to get out of a job, the more you can figure out whether a job that you're considering fits that. There's also no best or ideal ability profile. It really depends on the person and job fit. And different jobs require different types of skills. People who work in fields where they have to do a lot of construction, whether they are architects or even plumbers, mechanics, where there's a lot of figuring out how things are connected to each other and how things work, they need a high level of visualization abilities. They need to really understand, you know, if this part breaks, how that whole engine is going to be affected, or, you know, if this engine is not running correctly, where do you look for that type of, where do you look to find the problem? But in other fields, you need to think more in the abstract, and you're in more of the field of ideas and words. And so that's different abilities, but it doesn't mean that one is better than the other or that one is less than the other. It's really whether your ability matches that job. So related to that, there's no perfect career. As we talked about, there's not just one way to do a job. There's different ways of doing things. And then the other thing is that over the course of your life, your situation changes, your circumstances change. As I started off with in the beginning, we focus a lot on development in children and not so much in adults. It's kind of like once you're over 21, all the adults are the same and they're kind of grouped into one category. But someone who's 22 years old and just graduated college is in a very different life circumstance than someone who's 42 years old, who's in a very different life circumstance than someone who's 62 years old. And those factors all impact your career. So you can change careers. In fact, many people change careers, and it's becoming more and more common, especially as people are moving out of an economy where you got one job that you worked at for 40 years, working 9 to 5, steady hours and on a salary. There are fewer and fewer of those types of positions, and more people who don't want to work in those types of positions, who want to be entrepreneurs, who want to do different things, run their own businesses. So there's lots of different ways to accomplish that. And then the last one is that the right job will just show up. And we know that you can wait around, but that you may need to take some action. So this is the Highlands Whole Person Model. And like I said, I'm going to give you a brief background on what that is and what factors go into this, how we conceptualize career decisions. But at the end of the presentation, I do have some resources. And if you're interested in learning more about the Highlands model or learning about these different factors, they have a whole book that describes this. So that is in the resource section. And the idea, again, is that you want your work to fit with who you are as a person, and the better the fit, the more aligned you feel and the more energized you feel. Typically, when people are looking for a change, it's because something is not aligned. There's some part of the job or the role that you're in that just doesn't fit with either who you are as a person or your circumstances or some factor. And sometimes that can be changed. So sometimes you can shift your role within an organization or delegate certain tasks to other people because they don't fit in with what you do best and your strengths are better utilized in a different way. And sometimes that means changing careers altogether. But understanding that really helps you to make those decisions and to see what your options are. So let's start with abilities. And this is kind of where I came in as a neuropsychologist. I do lots of tests where I test people's IQ and I test how their executive function skills, which are like things like organization, planning, managing time, those kinds of skills. And those are sort of abilities that are natural to you and sort of part of who you are as a person. Those of you on this webinar who are organized people, if I asked you to think back to when you became organized, you probably can't identify that. To you, it's probably like, I've just always been that way. I've always been the kid who had a neat room and knew where my things were and kept things orderly. And then those of you who maybe organization is not your strength, if I asked you to think back, you probably have the same experience, that it's always been that way, that, you know, things were always all over the place, or things were, you know, always, you know, you could find it, but other people would think that there was a problem, or they couldn't understand your system. So abilities are the things that are naturally just part of who we are. It requires very little effort on your part to develop an ability. So if you have good verbal abilities, for example, you're good with words and good verbal reasoning, those things probably come easily to you. Reading was probably enjoyable to you. You like those kinds of activities. They energize you. You don't feel drained when you have to do a lot of work with words and ideas. Other people who are more visual, have stronger visual abilities, again, don't feel strained. They actually feel energized by using those abilities. So it's really key to understand what your abilities are. And as a neuropsychologist, psychological testing tests a lot of these abilities, but where it was lacking was it didn't connect that to a job. So if you have good abilities, natural abilities in one area, how does that relate to a specific career? And that's really where the Highlands Ability Battery came into play, because it makes that connection. So it connects these specific abilities with how they play out in the workplace, and helps you identify what kinds of career would be a good fit. The second area that we look at are skills, and these are things that are learned and practiced. So you may not have a natural ability for some component of your job, but you can certainly learn it, and we all can learn things. So the more you practice something, the more you learn it, but these are things that are always going to be more effortful than your natural abilities. Where if you're doing something that relies on something you're naturally good at, that usually energizes you and you feel activated, and you feel like you can keep doing that. It comes easily to you. When things are reliant on skills, it takes more effort, and so it can be more tiresome. So you may want to try and balance that. If you can build your skills on things that you have a natural ability for, that really helps. To give you an example, let's say you are somebody who's really good at spatial visualization. You can really conceptualize things. And I'll give you an example of how we test that at the end of today's presentation. But someone who's good at visualizing the relationships between things. And typically these are people who are really good at understanding mechanical relationships, understanding how things work. You may talk to them and they may tell you, they've always been that way since they were young. They always like to take things apart, tinker with them, figure out how they worked, build new things. I've worked with people who've been able to, who will tell me as a child, they would take old computer parts and build them together to make a functioning computer, or they would build radios out of different computer parts. I would not even know where to start with something like that. That's not sort of how my brain works. So those people have that natural ability. But then let's say they want to learn a specific career. We can then teach them those skills. And because they have a natural ability in those areas, those skills are much easier for them to learn. So if you wanted to teach somebody who has this natural visualization capacity, how to put together an engine or how to build a computer or they can probably learn it a lot faster with less effort than somebody like me who doesn't have that as an area of strength. Excuse me. So that's where skills and abilities really can play off of each other. Now, could you learn to do something that doesn't rely on your natural abilities? Absolutely. I gave you the example of me with scissors. My cutting has gotten a lot better since I was in kindergarten, but it's still not a strength for me. There was a joke in my house through this whole quarantine that we're outside of Philadelphia, so for several months, all hairdressers and barber shops were closed down due to COVID, and my partner would absolutely not let me cut his hair. He would rather it grow long because he was, he knows my skills with scissors. So, those kinds of things. I sort of have a limit to what I can do because that doesn't align with my natural abilities. But other things that I learn that align with my natural abilities, I can learn much easier. And the educational system is really built around teaching skills. If you think about what you learn in school, math, reading, those are all skills that are taught and practiced and done over time and assessed over time. And the more that you do something, the more it becomes part of who you are and easier to do. So some of these skills may seem like they're abilities because it seems like you do them effortlessly because you've done them so many times. But when we go back, we can realize that those were things that were taught. There's a saying that neuropsychologists have, and probably neurologists and other people who work with the brain, which is that the neurons that fire together wire together. So the more you do something that activates a certain pathway in the brain, the stronger that pathway becomes, for better or for worse. So that means that practice, the saying is practice makes perfect, but really practice makes permanent. So if you learn it incorrectly in the first place, it's very hard to undo that. To give you another example, I have a friend named Jeff, and Jeff and I were taking a dance class together. And so we would go to this class every week. And for some reason, when I first met Jeff, I thought his name was Justin. And so for weeks, every time we would go to this class, I would call him Justin, and he didn't correct me for a few weeks because I guess he, didn't want to embarrass me. But eventually he said to me, my name isn't Justin. But by that point, I had that connection between his face and Justin had become so strong that he told me his name was Jeff. But then for weeks after, I couldn't remember that his name was Jeff. I just knew it wasn't Justin. So that connection was still there. I just knew so I called him not Justin for a while, and I would say, I'm so sorry. I know your name is not Justin, but I can't remember what your name is. And so now we have a joke about it. But that's an example of, you know, the more you do things with skills, the more permanent they become, for better or for worse. But that's where skills really come into play in the job sector. Then we have to look at interests, and this is where a lot of career assessments focus. So there are a lot of career assessments, you may have taken them even in high school, where they're interest inventories. So they give you different scenarios, different job roles, different situations, and you rate how much you would be interested in that. And it gives you some ideas for jobs that might align with your interest. At the end of the presentation under the resources, there's 2 links to 2 of these. One is ONET, which is the federal government's occupational site. They have a career assessment there, an interest inventory. They call it the interest profiler, I believe. And you can take that, it's free. It's about 60 questions, so it probably takes about 15 or 20 minutes. And you can just go through and answer those questions, and it'll give you a list of, you know, the top 50 careers that align with your interests. And so some of them may be things that you had considered, and some of them may be things that you hadn't considered. And so it's a good way to look at those areas. There's another one called the self-directed search, which is a little bit more in-depth. And again, I have the link at the end of today's presentation, but the self-directed search actually right now is currently free. They made it free due to COVID. I don't know how long that will be. It just says limited time. It doesn't say a deadline. So if you're interested in taking the self-directed search for free, you might want to do that sooner rather than later. But again, it's very similar to ONET's interest profiler. There's a series of statements, and you rate whether that appeals to you or that doesn't appeal to you. And then it generates a list of careers related to that. So it's important to know what your interests are, because again, that interacts with your abilities and your skills. Skills are also, we talked about skills can be easier to learn if your abilities align with them, but also if you're interested, then you're more motivated to work on that. So if you're really interested in an area, even if it's something that doesn't come naturally to you, you're more willing to put in that effort and put in that work to learn the skill to do it than if you weren't interested. So it provides that motivation and helps you to really stay focused and committed to that for a longer period of time and persevere on that goal. We then look at personal style, and these are personality characteristics. So I talked about earlier, the Myers-Briggs type inventory is one example of a personality profiler that gives you some information about how you operate in the work environment. These are things like whether you're more introverted or extroverted, whether you are more of a logical thinker or you do things based on your emotions and gut reactions. So those styles are really important because that plays a role in different types of jobs. People who are more logical in their thinking may be able to consider more facts, but they may not be able to make decisions quickly. Somebody who is more reactive and intuitive may be able to make decisions quickly, but may miss certain parts of information. And both of those decision-making qualities can be assets in different types of jobs, and they can also be areas of weakness in other types of jobs. So it's really important to know that about yourself so that you know whether your natural tendency is something that's going to be useful in your job or not, and if not, to be aware of that so that you know how to address that. So as a psychologist, we do different personality measures as well that look at different factors of personality. And then the Highlands Ability Battery, which I'll talk about later, also has some measures of personal style, again, like being introverted versus extroverted, being more of a generalist, so somebody who likes to do lots of different things, but in their career or in their job, so you like to have a role where you're overseeing things, as opposed to someone who's a specialist, who likes to go really in depth in a particular area and focus on that, but not doesn't necessarily want to be managing everything. And again, there's roles for both of those. Generalists tend to do much better in administrative type roles, where specialists tend to do better in situations that are more specialized and focused, and where they can really hone in on their areas of interest. So that's where personal style comes into play. Family is also important to consider. Both your current family situation, whatever that is, whether you are single, married, have children, are taking care of parents, have extended family members that you're taking care of, as well as what your family's values were growing up, what your culture was, what your family's financial situation was. Those things all impact how you make decisions and what kinds of careers you might think are acceptable for you, what kinds of careers people expect you to have. Family roles, I know, now we're dealing with a pandemic, and family roles have become very important in thinking about careers, because a lot of people are working from home, and those of us with children are trying to manage childcare and work, and manage the household all at the same time, and it's challenging. And so those kinds of things can affect your job performance, and what kind of job you want at that particular moment, and how that fits you. So considering your family of origin, your current family situation is really important. Values are another area that's really important to think about. And we can talk about, religious or spiritual values, moral values, the things that you really consider to be important in your work. And these are, examples. Some people really value hard work. And so for them, they don't feel accomplished unless they have a job that is challenging to them and that they have to really exert a lot of effort into. And sometimes, they want a physically demanding job. Where other people, their primary value is they want to make a difference, or they want to help somebody, or they want to do something where they can have a positive impact. There's no judgment as to which of those, neither of those is better or worse than the other. It's just what is your priority, what value is key for you. And sometimes people find that values really come into play and when they're dissatisfied with a job, especially if the job fits you in these other areas, your abilities, your skills, your interests, your personal style, your family situation, but it just isn't rewarding and doesn't align with your core values. So that is another thing to consider. Typically, there's different ways of looking at values. People look at like lists of values where you kind of identify which ones are important to you, and you kind of go through multiple passes of the list and gradually whittle that down to maybe your top 3 to 5 core values that are essential to you. And that's one way to go about doing that. So values are really important. Goals, both long-term and short-term goals. So where do you want to be in a year, 5 years, 10 years? What do you want your life to look like? Those can all go into your career decision. There's different ways of thinking about that. And then, obviously right now in the middle of a pandemic, it's hard to set goals because you don't know what's happening, and things are changing, and we're all being asked to be very flexible and to make changes on the fly, which is hard in setting goals. But if you have a clear vision of where you want to be in the long term, you can also see this current situation as a temporary situation, and still take steps to getting to that long-term goal, even if you have to, take a diversion or take a little bit of a different route to get there because of the current situation. So really clarifying goals, taking those long-term goals and breaking them down into the steps, and so that you're making progress towards them, even though other situations may come up and impact how you're reaching them. And then finally, we think about what stage of your career are you in. So if the Highlands starts, you could give it to someone as young as 16. So a 16-year-old may be just thinking about, I want some clarity about what major I might like in college, or what kind of job might be I want to do when I get out of high school. They don't necessarily have that long-term perspective or job experience to give them that perspective. But they're using it as a way to help identify narrow down that decision. Other people are at different stages. And we have to consider that in terms of figuring out a career. If someone is in their 60s and wants to do a career in medicine that's going to take 10 years of training, that's a very different type of conversation than someone who's 18 years old and wants a career in medicine and is going to take 10 years of training. So where you are in your career, what experiences you've had, again, the clients who I work with who are older and have more life and job experience have a different perspective on things. You have more experience of what you like and what you don't like, what you're willing to tolerate and what you're not willing to tolerate, than younger clients. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about where you are in your life and what is your, again, looking at all of these factors, but really incorporating that as well. So that's a brief overview of the whole person model that kind of underlies the Highlands approach to doing a career assessment. And like I said, if you want more information about that model, there's some links at the end of this presentation. So I'm going to talk about career assessment and really talk about the Highlands Ability Battery in particular, because I think it's one that isn't as well known as some of these other ones, but I think it has a really unique way of looking at things, and gives you other sources of information. So here's just some information about what it is. So if you were to do the Highlands Ability Battery, there's 19 work samples, and I'll show you what some of those look like. But the idea here is that it's an objective measurement of your natural abilities. So what does that mean? It means that things are timed, so you have to respond quickly. And part of the reason for that is that things that are your natural abilities, you can respond quickly. Some of these things that are on the Highlands, as far as work samples, may be things that you could do with time because you've learned strategies of how to do them. They're more skills for you. But if we're really looking at your abilities, we want to see what comes naturally to you, and things that come naturally are automatic and require less effort. So it's timed. Your performance is compared to other people who have taken the Highlands. So you're not expected to get all of the answers right. This isn't a grade. It's not like in school where you get an A or a D on the test. There's no grade. And as I said earlier, there's no profile that's really ideal. That the ideal fit is when your profile meets the fit for that job. Not necessarily, that you should have any kind of particular profile. But the percentile scores give you a sense of where do you fit in the ranking of people who've taken the Highlands. It's based on your performance. So unlike some of the other career assessments that we talked about, like the Myers-Briggs, or even some of the interest inventories that are based on your opinions and you filling out ratings of yourself, this is an objective test based on your performance. So it gives you a different source of information and a different type of information in making that decision. And then there is, it's been researched. And then finally, it doesn't tell you you can't or you can do something. As we talked about, everybody has the capacity to learn. It's just whether you want to put the effort in and how much effort is it going to take you to learn that. So by understanding your abilities, you can know whether it's going to be relatively easy or relatively hard for you to learn a specific skill, and then you can decide whether that learning that skill is worth putting in that effort. So here's just a little bit more information about how it focuses on your natural abilities. So again, there's no single ability that is the best one to have or that you really want to have. Nothing controls everything. But when you understand your own natural abilities, you can have a better fit with your career. Sometimes where people feel like careers are not satisfying to them or they're not fulfilling is because they have a talent in an area that's just not being tapped by that career. And to be honest, we just looked at 8 factors that go into that career person fit. It may be hard to find a career that matches all 8 of those factors for you. And so, but if you know that about yourself, then you may say, well, I'm not going to rely on my career to meet this other need. I'm going to seek that out in terms of a hobby or in other things that I do in my life, so that I can feel like my life is fulfilled. And I'm not going to rely on my career to provide me fulfillment in that particular area. But again, that's making that more of an intentional process rather than just a subconscious or something that you didn't really address directly, and you're just have this vague feeling of mismatch. And then and so that's why it's really important to look at your natural abilities. This is just some more information about the Highlands and different scenarios. I'm going to show you what some of the ways that the Highlands test some of these areas and what some of the assessment looks like, and compare that to some of the assessments that the other assessments we talked about, the Myers-Briggs, the interest inventories, where it's really a statement and you rate how much that statement you agree with or disagree with that statement, or anything in between. The Highlands gives you some different ways of assessing. So here's an example of one of the items on the Highlands. This, one of the subtests, is just called spatial relations visualization. And what you have to do here is you have to look at that shape that's up at number 1. And then you have to look at A, B, and C down below and figure out which one is the same as one just rotated. Only one of them is the same as one rotated in a different direction. And you have to do it quickly. As I said, the Highlands times this. So people who are naturally skilled at visualizing things, they can do this quickly. They can look at that and they pick out the answer. Some of you may be sitting on this call and you immediately, as soon as you saw this, you knew what the answer was. Others of you may be in this webinar and may be thinking like, I know that this is not my strength, and I know that this is, not something that I'm good at, and this is really challenging to me. And both of those are okay, because we all need those different skills. So just in case you were wondering, I'll give you a few seconds to figure out what answer you think it is. But here we go. So the answer is C, because that would be the same as if you rotated that. So again, this is very different than some of the other career assessments where it's really just statements that you're rating. This is an actual measure of performance of a specific type of ability. I'll give you another example. This one is design memory. And so what you have to do here is you'll see this picture for a few seconds. I forget exactly how long, but your goal is to try and remember how those lines are connected to the dots, because then we're going to remove the lines and leave the dots, and you have to connect them to make this same pattern. So you would see this for a few seconds, and then you would see this and have to connect those dots to make that same pattern. So that's another example, just so you can see again. So here's what the original design looked like, and here's what you would then be presented with. And so some of you, again, on this call might know immediately. You might be able to connect those dots and make it look exactly like this. Others of you might look at this and it just, you know, it doesn't compute in your brain, or it doesn't fit with how you think about things. And again, it's okay, because there's no best profile. But the idea is that if we know that you're really good at this, then this steers us in a certain direction for when we what careers fit that. And if we know that this is not your strength, it steers us in a different direction for careers. So again, there's no good or bad to this. This isn't a judgment. Here's another example. This is verbal memory test. And so what happens first is you're shown a list of made up words, which you can see here. And each word is paired with an English word. So let's say blurk is paired with egg. And you're given a short time to study that. The word pairs, to try and learn them, and then the English words are taken away, the made up nonsense words are reordered, and then you have to fill in what word went with that pair. And so again, some of you, this would be easier than others. Here's another example of concept organization, which is another task on the Highlands. Here is basically, you're creating like a flow chart here of these terms along the top. So bread, pig, sandwich, farm, wheat, and ham. And you're going to put them in a way that would make a flow chart. So to show you what that would look like, here you go. So you start with a farm. A farm has wheat and pigs. Pigs become ham. Wheat becomes bread, which then leads to a sandwich. And again, some of you are really good logical, sequential thinkers, and so this is easy for you. You're able to see those words, see the relationships, see how it's put them together. Other people don't have that strength and see things in a different way, so they may think about things differently. But again, this is different than, this is looking at some logical thinking, which we talked about like on the Myers-Briggs, when it talks about whether you are a logical thinker versus a feeling person who does things on gut reaction. The Myers-Briggs scores you based on your perception of yourself. This scores you based on your performance, which is a different source of information. And then, so those are some examples of how this particular career assessment works and how it looks at things, which is, again, different from these other ones. Your results, you're given a score of a percentile. So we talked about, so for percentiles, for those who are unfamiliar with that, that tells you where you would rank sort of in a group of 100 people. So there's a sample of people who've taken the Highlands Ability Battery, and they're ranked in different, in their performance on these different tests. And so if you scored at the 30th percentile on a test, that means your score was at the same level or better than 30 of the 30% of the people roughly who took the test. If you're at the 80th percentile, that means your performance was equal to or better than 80% of the people. But again, as we talked about, this isn't a grade. So you're not supposed to get 100. You can't get 100 percentile because the highest you can get is 99. But the goal here is not to get 100%. It's different than tests you've taken in school, because it's really looking at, your standing relative to other people. So for example, sometimes what happens for people is they really struggle on certain tests, but then they find out that they did really well. And that may happen because that test is difficult for lots of people. So if lots of people do, struggle with that, then even though you struggled, you might have struggled less than other people. Excuse me, one moment. So that's where, percentiles really give you relative information and compare you to a group of people who have taken the test, not just based on like a single measure of performance. And there's different strengths at each of these levels. In some skills and some roles, you want to be low in certain skills because you don't want to be operating in a way that that doesn't work, that isn't compatible with that role. And in other things you want to be high, and in other things you want to be in the middle. But again, none of these are better or worse. It's just sort of where you fall. And so what you end up getting when you do the Highlands is a profile like this. This is for a made-up person, but it gives you a sense of these are the different, on the left are the different types of areas that are assessed by the Highlands and where this person fell in these different areas. And then we look at your patterns of things and figure out what kinds of jobs align with those kinds of patterns. So the Highlands takes these abilities and then connects them to specific jobs based on what we know about that job and what kinds of abilities and skills are required. So you get a profile like this, and it really tells you kind of where you would fit well. It also tells you why certain things may not be a good fit for you. So this person, if you look at extrovert and introvert, so this person is a strong introvert, which means that they are energized by time by themselves. It's not that they don't want to be around other people, but that can be draining for them when they're around other people too much, and if they're working on groups, and that can be something that they need then alone time to recharge. If they're in a position where all of their work is in groups and with a team, and they're constantly having to interact with people, they may come home from work feeling drained every single day. Not because they don't like the work, not because the job role isn't good, but because of that component of the job. If they're in something like sales, where they're having to do a lot of cold calls or things like that, that may not be a good fit for them based on that, even if it fits in other areas. So this is where having this profile can really help figure out, either what kinds of careers to explore and to look into if you're looking to change careers, or if you're trying to figure out why is this career that I thought was going to be a good fit for me, why is it not fitting? And if it doesn't fit, is there a way that I could change my role or revamp what I'm doing to make it fit better? So I'm going to end today's presentation, and we're going to stop the recording after the presentation is over, so that those of you who want to ask questions, we can have question and answer session, and I'm happy to stick around for that, but we don't want to have that on the recording. So I'm just going to end today with this quote. You rarely have time for everything you want in this life, so you need to make choices. And hopefully your choices can come from a deep sense of who you are. And I'm going to see if you know who said this quote before I show you. But the reason I put this in here is that this is where a career assessment helps. As we talked about, there's lots of factors that go into figuring out whether a specific career or job role or responsibility is a good match for you. But there's trade-offs to that, and you have to decide which ones you're willing to trade off on and which ones you're not. And that making that conscious decision can really help to help you feel better about the decision and to help you make a decision that's with more clarity and intention and purpose. We're dealing with an economic situation right now due to COVID, where you may be put in a position where you have to take a job or a role that isn't what you want. It's not ideal. But if you can see that as a stepping stone to getting to your ideal situation or a temporary situation, it makes that more bearable than if it feels like this interminable thing that's never going to end and you're going to be stuck there forever. So that's where the choices come into play. The goal of the career assessment is to give you choices and not to make the decision for you. The career assessment is not going to say you should do this or you have to do this. It's really to give you the option to make that choice for yourself with information that would help in making that decision. And so those of you who, some of you may know this quote, but this comes from Mr. Rogers. And so, it's one of those things that is, Mr. Rogers talked to preschoolers, but this is a quote that's really relevant for adults and really relevant to thinking about your career. I promised you some resources. So here's some websites. If you are interested, the Highlands Ability Battery that we talked about, if you want to find a consultant who does the Highlands Ability Battery, there is a link to that. They have consultants in every state, so I know probably many of you are in New Jersey, but we may have people joining from different states. And then if you want more information on today's topic and about like the whole person model, that link takes you to the book, Don't Waste Your Talent, which really talks about that model in much more depth, gives you different exercises that you can do to really clarify your interests, your abilities, your values, sort of walks you through that step-by-step process. I also talked about the interest inventories that are available for free. So the ONET interest profiler, that one's always free at this My Next Move website. The nice thing about that is when it generates a list of careers that you're interested in, you could then click those different careers and it'll take you to a page that tells you what kind of education is required for that. Do you need special certifications? Do you, what is the salary outlook for that position? What does that job really do? Because sometimes you get things that come back as a role and it's a job that you've never heard of before. So you can click on that and it'll give you some information and where to get more information. The self-directed search is another one I said is currently free due to COVID. The publisher has made that free and they they don't have a deadline on that. So it just says limited time for COVID that this is free. So if you're interested in taking that, you probably want to take that soon. And that's the website that you can go to take that for free. And then finally, this is my contact information. So if you have specific questions or want to talk to me more, certainly you can reach out to me through my website, through the contact form, by phone. My office is in Bensalem, but because of COVID, a lot of things I'm doing virtually right now, including this webinar. So we can figure that out. All right, and so that's the end of the presentation. I think we're going to switch over to some questions whenever we're ready.
Okay, thank you, Rosemary. We do have some questions.